Hey guys, welcome back and thanks for joining me. I'm your host, Sherry. I know I've been off for a couple weeks, but I promise you guys are going to love this story. Today's case is a crazy love triangle murder disappearance case. It takes place in Florida in the year 2000. Destiny's Child was number one on the music charts. George Bush was president. 9/11 hadn't happened yet. Castaway was showing in theaters. I remember this year well because it was the year my son was born. It was a simpler time back then, but not for the subject of this story. This is the case of Jerry Mike Williams. Jerry Mike Williams was born on October 16th, 1969. He went by his middle name, Mike, and that's what I'll continue to call him. He grew up with his brother Nick and his dad, who was a school bus driver, and his mom, who ran a daycare. They lived in a trailer and they didn't have much money, but they could have had a better home and nicer things if they wanted. They were using a lot of their income to make sure their two sons went to a really nice private school. Mike was a typical student and played football, and he was a part of some clubs. When he was 15, he began duck hunting. This would be a lifelong passion of his. He went on to college and majored in political science. He married a woman named Denise in 1994, and the couple had a little girl together in 1999. Mike is busy working all the time as a real estate appraiser, and sometimes he was even working 18 hours a day. He was known a lot of the time to go to work in the morning and then work until evening, come home for dinner with his wife and his daughter, and then he would go back to work and work until the wee hours of the morning, and then he would get off and go duck hunting. He was making $200,000 per year, so all these hours he was putting in at work allowed him and Denise and their infant daughter to have a nice home and nice things. Now, friends of the couple say they had a wonderful marriage and he treated her like a queen. They said she would call him at work and say she was going to go shopping, but she needed gas. He would come right home, take her car out, fill it up full of gas, and bring it back to her, and then go back to work. He was a good husband and a father, and he was well liked by everyone. Mike had a best friend named Brian Winchester. Brian was an insurance salesman. So in 1999, after their daughter was born, Mike tells Brian he wants to make sure that if anything ever happens to him, his wife and daughter would be taken care of. He gets a $1.7 million life insurance policy on himself. His father had just passed away recently, and he was thinking about his own mortality. As I mentioned, Brian was his best friend. Brian's wife and Brian and Mike and Denise were two couples that did everything together. They went out to dinners, vacations, etc. The two guys were best buds, and the two women got along great. They even bought their houses together, and they had a baby at the same time, and they got married at the same time. On December 16th, 2000, this is 6 months after he got that huge life insurance policy. His daughter is around a year old. This is also he and Denise's 6th wedding anniversary. They had plans that night to leave the baby with a sitter and go out and celebrate with a fancy dinner and drinks. So it's morning, and Mike is going to go duck hunting. He tells Denise, "I'll be home in a few hours, and we'll start getting ready for our big night out." A few hours pass, and Mike hasn't come home. It's around lunchtime at this point. Like I told you in the Bison Dell case, it's 2000 and cell phones weren't a real big thing. They didn't have GPS technology, and you didn't just call or text people like we do now. So Mike doesn't have a cell phone on him. Denise calls Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester, and says, "Look, Mike went out duck hunting this morning. He hasn't come home yet, which isn't like him. Can you go out to Lake Seminole and see if his truck is there, or just look around and make sure he's not broken down somewhere on the side of the road?" Brian and his dad get in their truck and drive to Lake Seminole. Brian knows the area of Lake Seminole where Mike likes to duck hunt, so that spot would be the first place that they check. They get there, and there it is. His 1994 Ford Bronco is sitting in the parking spot. It's right near the boat launch. Brian and his dad contact the Florida Fish and Wildlife Rangers, and a search begins. The sheriff's department show up, but they're just there as support. The main ones in charge of the search are the Florida Fish and Wildlife Rangers. The reason for this is that this is their area. This is what they do for a living. If a hunter or boater is in need of help, they help them. They're better equipped for the searches than the sheriff's department would be. Both the sheriff's department and the wildlife rangers agree on one thing, that they don't see this as a foul play case. They think Mike was out on his boat, duck hunting like he's done hundreds of times before. He falls out of his boat and has drowned, or he was eaten by alligators. In order to confirm this theory, they have to find his boat, and more importantly, they have to find Mike. A helicopter is circling above the lake looking for signs, and they spot Mike's boat. It wasn't very far from the boat ramp where his Ford Bronco was. It was initially thought to be one of the search boats, so it was dismissed. But it was indeed Mike's boat. I've seen pictures of Mike's boat. It's very small, and it looks like any regular fishing boat. The detectives look in the boat, and there is Mike's shotgun still in its case. This was the shotgun that he used for duck hunting, so he probably hadn't even started when he disappeared. There is still no signs of Mike, and now a massive search is taking place. This part of Lake Seminole where his boat was found was very stumpy. There were major tree stumps and roots in the water, so the searchers believe what happened was he hit one of those stumps and it knocked him out of the boat and into the water. Mike always wore waders when he was duck hunting, so if he fell into the water, his waders would have filled with water right away and it would be really difficult to get out of and you would most likely drown. The searchers saw alligators circling around in this area, and you put two and two together and you guys have a pretty good idea about what happened, and this case is now closed, except that might not be what happened. This case of a missing husband and father who was presumed to have fallen into Lake Seminole and drowned or was eaten by alligators is going to turn upside down. A storm is rolling in, so they have to stop searching for the day, but they start back up again in the morning. The searchers sit down and carefully explain to Denise that he most likely drowned, and within 3 to 7 days, his body would float to the top of the water. They weren't giving up, they just wanted her to be prepared. They were still going to skim the lake. A few days go by, and then a week goes by. There's still no sign of Mike. The 2 months go by, and there's still no sign. They had searched the waters high and low multiple times. The police said they would have continued searching, but Denise wasn't interested in continuing the searches. She felt her husband would never be found and didn't want to waste all these resources every day. The case was still open and very active, but there wasn't any actual lake dredging going on and boats out there every day looking for a body. They assumed Mike's body had gotten tangled in all the brush underneath the water and that alligators eventually found it. One day after the search was over, Denise arranged a memorial service for her husband. A couple of things are important here that come to light. There have been 80 disappearances in that water, one of them being Mike. 79 bodies were recovered. The only one that was not recovered was Mike Williams. An alligator expert was brought in, and he made the following very clear. Remember how it was December when Mike disappeared? It was 9 days before Christmas. Well, this Florida alligator expert said that these alligators do not feed in the winter. If his body had fallen overboard, the alligators may have circled it, but they wouldn't eat it. That's not in their nature to do that. The water was 58 degrees that day. The only interest an alligator has is keeping its body temperature normal. It's not interested in eating. I learned more about alligators researching this case than I ever learned in school, and they are really interesting creatures. I learned that if it was summertime, the alligators would have had a feast with his body as soon as it hit the water. But in winter, they're very calm and they won't bother you. I'm not endorsing swimming with alligators here, by the way, or telling you it's safer in the wintertime. I'm just letting you know what this expert said. He also said if for some crazy reason this alligator defied all alligator behavior and did eat the body, you would find evidence left behind. Also, Mike was 5 foot 10 inches tall. Most things that have been eaten by alligators are small, like children or family pets. The expert concluded that he was 100% certain that Mike was not eaten by an alligator. 6 months after Mike disappeared, investigators had no new leads and no real hope of finding him. Denise wants her husband declared legally dead. The court says, nah, it's going to be 5 years before we can declare him legally dead. Well, she doesn't want to wait that long. She wants that $1.7 million life insurance policy, so she's pissed. She's a single mom now, and money is tight. Remember, Mike was making $200,000 per year, so she's used to living a very comfortable stay-at-home mom life. She isn't living like she was before. The very next day, a clue pops up. A fisherman is out on the water and he sees a pair of waders floating by him. So he grabs them and notices these are really nice Gore-Tex waders. Well, they belong to Mike Williams. Investigators are scratching their heads because they've searched this area dozens of times and they weren't there before. Then, 2 days later, Mike's fishing jacket and his hunting license were found at the same spot, along with a flashlight. Forensics dissects the waders, and they were in immaculate condition. There was no teeth marks. They ran some kind of test, and there was no sign of human remains on them. The flashlight was in perfect condition, too. It even turned on once it had dried out. And the investigators were joking with each other that they needed to get a couple of these flashlights because they work so well. Remember, Mike's been gone for 6 months. There was no buildup of algae or whatever shit you would find on an object that's been submerged underwater for 6 months. A good friend of Mike's said that it was very rare that Mike would have gone duck hunting alone. He always took a buddy with him. He was extremely careful when it came to safety. His guns were always stored at his work because he had a little daughter at home. He also never put his waders on until he was out of the water for the same reason I told you earlier. If you fall out of the boat, your waders are going to fill up with water and you're going to drown. This friend knows this because he had gone duck hunting with Mike before and he would preach to him about it constantly. The whole thing is just starting to get really weird. A new investigation is getting ready to take place. The problem here is that, remember, initially they didn't think there was any foul play, so the original investigators didn't secure a crime scene. The boat wasn't tested for blood or DNA. Trying to start from scratch after so much time has passed would be really difficult. They're not really making this a top priority either. They have other more recent cases that they're working on and so on. Also, Mike's boat and his Ford Bronco have footsteps and volunteer searchers and police DNA all over the place, so they couldn't really do anything with it. It's very, very contaminated at this point. Again, this is 6 months after Mike disappeared. Denise is determined to have him declared legally dead. She doesn't want to wait the 5 years. So she gets a lawyer who was able to make that happen for her. Denise's attorney argued to a judge that the waders, the vest, and the hunting license were proof enough that Mike was dead. The judge agreed and issued a death certificate. The cause of death was declared as accidental drowning while duck hunting on Lake Seminole. Body has not yet been recovered. What I haven't talked to you guys about this entire time is Mike's mother, Mrs. Cheryl Williams. You guys, if there was a woman who deserves an award, it would be this woman. I'm going to get into Mike's mother. First off, Miss Cheryl is an elderly woman, but she is full of fire. She is not one to sit tight and let the police do their work. Nope, she is passionate, and she loves her son more than anyone else in this world. She is ready to fight for justice. Once she realized that his death couldn't have been from falling into the water and drowning, she would spend the rest of her life fighting and finding whoever hurt her baby. This woman is someone that you do not want to be on her bad side because she will make your life a living hell. A lot of you, like myself, have children, and I want to believe that we would all be able to see where her pain is coming from. She is determined to get to the bottom of this. Miss Cheryl starts her own campaign to figure out what happened. She asked Denise to help her, and Denise said no. Miss Cheryl is upset because everyone is moving on and forgetting about her son. She knows he's not in that lake, so where is he? He didn't just stage a disappearance and run off to start a new life. He had a great life. The most puzzling thing was that the waiters popped up as soon as Denise needed something to prove he was dead. Her mother's intuition is telling her someone planted that stuff there and something happened to him that morning. She is going to find out exactly what that was, but it wouldn't be easy. The local news picks up on her story, and many think she is just this crazy mom who just can't accept that her son drowned, but she doesn't care. Miss Cheryl takes 27 pages worth of notes she's written about things that seem suspicious. Denise tells her she is cut off and that if she keeps this shit up, she will never see her granddaughter again. Miss Cheryl decides that this is a risk that she's going to take. She said she is going to take that energy that she would have spent loving on her little granddaughter and use it to find her dad for her. This is where the story starts to get very dramatic and things begin coming into light that have been hidden away for a long time. A few years have passed now, and do you guys remember Mike's best friend, Brian Winchester? Him and his wife were best friends with the couple, and they did everything together. Remember, Brian sold Mike the $1.75 million life insurance policy 6 months before he disappeared? Well, Brian and his wife had gotten a divorce at this point, and Brian is seen around town with who other than Denise. They are seen shopping and laughing, eating dinner out together. People are getting suspicious. Why is he in a relationship with his best friend's wife? I know people move on, but this seems really weird considering the circumstances. Brian and Denise end up getting married. Well, one friend was at their wedding, and she said she's watching it and thinking to herself this whole time that both of them did something to Mike. While the pastor is speaking, he tells the audience that he counseled the couple and there are no secrets about them that he doesn't know. The girl nudged her husband and says, well, there may be one little secret that he doesn't know about, and they both quietly laughed. It was kind of like the elephant in the room. Why is this guy marrying his buddy's wife? Brian's now ex-wife says that she discovered Brian and Denise were having an affair months before Mike disappeared. In 2007, Mike's case is closed due to lack of evidence and is filed away as a cold case. Not to Miss Cheryl, though. She is just getting started. She got the Investigation Discovery Channel to run a story about Mike's case. I want to make this next part very clear because it's so important that you realize this mother's love for her son, if I can get through it without crying. Every day for 9 years, Miss Cheryl wrote a letter to the Florida governor asking to have a different agency look into her son's case because she believes her son was murdered by either Denise or Brian or them together. Now they're happily married and living the good life off of Mike's life insurance money. That's 9 years worth of letters every single day. She found out each daily letter was forwarded unopened to the police headquarters where it was placed in Mike's case file. Miss Cheryl said they couldn't have hurt me more if they would have punched me in the face. In 2012, this is now 12 years after Mike disappeared, Denise and Brian separate. Denise said the reason for this is Brian's sex addiction. In 2015, the divorce is finalized. In August of 2016, Denise is leaving her home to head to her job at Florida State University. Well, she's driving and suddenly someone climbs out of her back seat, and it was Brian who was hiding back there. He takes her phone from her and begins yelling directions at her of where to drive. He is pointing a gun at her. He claims she won't take his calls and blocked his text messages, so this was necessary that he kidnap her like this. Instead of driving where Brian wanted her to go, she pulls into a CVS parking lot right next to the door. Brian tells Denise he is planning on killing himself with this gun, and he says he's not going to kill her. She is able to calm him down and says, "Look, let me just take you to wherever you parked your truck before you hid in my car." He decides this would be okay. She drives him to his truck. Before he gets out, he takes some items with him that he had hidden in Denise's car in the back seat, a sheet, a spray bottle full of bleach, and a plastic sheet. You guys have listened to enough of my podcast that you know why he would need those items. Brian apologized to Denise and asked her not to tell the police about this incident. She says she won't, but after she pulls away, she dials 911 and tells them her crazy ex just kidnapped her. Brian was arrested and charged with kidnapping and domestic assault. Brian is held in jail for a while because of this. This really makes Miss Cheryl happy because she knows Brian isn't going to let Denise roll around alone with all that money. She thinks Brian will start talking about what happened, so Denise will be arrested as well. Miss Cheryl also says that she is the only person in the entire family holding out hope that this case will be solved. Everyone else in the family had moved on, and Mike, although he wasn't forgotten, he wasn't fresh in their minds every day. For Miss Cheryl, he's on her mind every second of the day. Brian has his day in court for the kidnapping. This is now 2017. He argued that he was upset that day because he found out his mom was very sick, and also his teenage son wanted to move in with his mom. He wasn't in a good headspace when he kidnapped Denise at gunpoint. This next part is really important. So the prosecutors wanted to give him the maximum sentence, which was 45 years for the kidnapping. Some talks happened behind closed doors. We don't know what was talked about right now, but you'll be able to figure it out because he was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. Think about that for a moment and you'll see what happened here. The very next day, a Florida special agent calls a news conference to announce that the body of Mike Williams was found. He was found at the end of a dead-end road 60 miles from where he was at Lake Seminole. It took backhoes digging over 9 feet in the ground to find his body. A DNA test was ran on the remains, and they matched Miss Cheryl's, so this body was definitely Mike's. The body had been there for 17 years. Also found with his remains were his flannel shirt and his wedding ring. The skeletal remains showed that he was killed by a shotgun very close to his face. You can just imagine what the skull looked like, that they were able to determine this just by looking at it with no additional forensic equipment. The police arrest Denise Williams for the murder of her husband. She was on her way to a birthday party for her daughter, who was now 19 years old. A 3-page indictment was released within 2 days, and it stated that Denise had conspired with Brian 9 months before her husband disappeared. It stated Brian Winchester went duck hunting with Mike Williams that morning. Remember his other friends said Mike never went alone? This also helped to confirm this. Brian shot Mike with a gun. Their motive was that Mike would not be found, be declared legally dead. Denise and Brian would live happily ever after with Mike's life insurance money, and raise Denise and Mike's daughter. Denise's lawyer said she was innocent of all the charges and had nothing to do with her husband's disappearance. He stated Brian killed Mike and that it was his idea. Well, Brian is now talking loud and clear. He's spilling all of their secrets. He confessed to killing Mike, but he said this whole thing was Denise's idea. He stated himself and Denise were high school sweethearts and their relationship never really ended. They just made sure their spouses never found out about it. They began their affair 3 years before Mike was killed. All the trips, dinners, and so on the two couples had gone on, and this whole time they were in love with each other. Brian even said they talked about the four of them going out on a boat together and staging a boating accident, and they could just throw Mike and Kathy overboard. But Brian said no because he didn't want to kill his children's mother. Brian says the day he killed Mike, he asked him to go out on Lake Seminole to duck hunt like they had done dozens of times before. They met at a gas station and went out together. Out on the water, he had Mike at gunpoint and told him to put the waders on. And you got to remember, this is his best friend. It's got to be I can't imagine what Mike was thinking this entire time. So he has Mike at gunpoint, he tells him to put the waders on, and then he pushed him out of the boat, thinking he would be unable to resurface and thus would drown, like I explained earlier. But instead, Mike managed to make it to a tree stump, so Brian shot Mike in the face. Since Mike's death could no longer be posed off as a boating accident, Brian buried the body, cleaned out his truck, and went to a family Christmas party. He and Denise avoided each other for a long while so that there wouldn't be any suspicions. Brian also said he kidnapped Denise after their divorce because he was afraid she would start talking all these years later. In February of 2019, Denise was sentenced to life in prison. Miss Sherrill addressed the court and said justice had finally been served and her son can rest in peace. Brian didn't get anything extra than the 20 years he was serving because in his agreement for the kidnapping sentence, nothing he said could be held against him. He told the prosecutors, "I'll be your star witness and I'll even tell you where the body is if you give me a lenient sentence for this kidnapping." This is completely normal in court and it's called immunity. He is still incarcerated until 2034 and will be in his 60s when he is released. 5 months later, all of Mike's money and his assets were awarded to his daughter, who is now 20 years old. Remember, she was only 1 year old when her dad disappeared. It was under the condition that none of the money could go to her mother's legal fees. Now, the only thing that really bothers me about the end of this story is that Mike and Denise's daughter has nothing to really do with her grandmother. Remember, her mom made Miss Sherrill cut ties with them when the girl was just a toddler. So she doesn't know her grandmother. She just knew she was this crazy woman fighting to have her mother locked up for murdering her dad. I wish his daughter would have reached out to Miss Sherrill, especially considering that she doesn't have many years left because she's already in her 80s or 90s. Miss Sherrill says she's happy the girl is financially independent now. That's all I can really do for her. I brought her daddy home, and I will always love her. Is it just me, or do you guys think that this girl should reach out to her grandmother? Like, thanks for getting an answer about my father's death and for writing the governor every day for 9 years. I think maybe she feels it would be a betrayal to her mom. I don't know. It just bothers me. For Miss Sherrill, it was a long, heartbreaking journey, but she finally got her answers she was looking for. I honestly feel if not for her, this case would have been closed in the first year. She fought for 18 years for justice for her son. Rest in peace to Mike Williams. That's it for this week, and I'll see you guys again soon. Take care, and much love to you all.